All right. The attendees are growing as we speak.
Okay, yeah, so there wasn't too many folks in the waiting room. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe there wasn't. I don't know. I
They're
see.
growing now. We can see them under participants, but we should.
So I'll pull up the splash screen now. We're recording. All good there. I think. Do you need anything from my end, Denny?
No, I don't think so.
Wait, I'm gonna
Thanks,
pull up
thanks,
on mute.
Lynn.
Yeah, no problem. I'm gonna go on mute and pull up the splash screen.
Good morning, everybody. We are awaiting more folks to join, and our guest, Ryan Howells, will be joining us as the seconds pass. My name is Denny Brennan. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, and I want to welcome you to today's discussion with Ryan Howells from Levitt Partners on digital identity and authentication. We know a lot and hear a lot about the challenges, the difficulties, the enormous work that goes into matching what appear to be data sets for the same person derived from different sources based on a range of patient matching techniques, which have grown in sophistication and accuracy over the years, but are a far cry from a simple solution to a complex problem. And perhaps as we move into an API economy, as we move into healthcare being more of a patient-centered enterprise where many of us have our digital authentication, we authenticate ourselves every day when we put our thumbs to our phones or allow our phones to recognize our faces. And in some respects, hundreds of millions of people have digital authentication right in their hands. The question is, how do we go from the world we are in now to a world where authentication and identity can be proven at a level that's much more granular, much more accurate, and takes advantage of the kind of techniques and technologies that are available to us today. Let me take a few moments to provide you with a little knowledge, a little information about our meeting today, and to give you a sense of who we are if you don't know us as the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium. First, please feel free to use social media. You can see MHDC's Twitter handle as well as Ryan Howells. You could see Ryan's organization alliances, both Levitt Partners and the CARIN Alliance. And you can see the event hashtags that we've set up, hashtag MHDC identity, hashtag mass health data. Rules of the road. You will all be muted during the presentation. Please enter your questions in the Q&A window on the bottom right of your screen. We will track your questions and we will answer them either in real time or at a point with Ryan where there is a suitable break in the presentation. But we are keen to get your comments and your questions, and we want to be sure we get those in front of you as quickly as possible. Additionally, we're recording today's webinar. You all know that. You've seen that when you came on board. If you don't want to be recorded, then you should sign off. We provide recordings and copies of our presentation after the event to those who are unable to attend. But we'll also be using the information in the recording to provide, the kind of content that organizations and individuals want to learn and be educated about how the industry is evolving. Last, we will take a moment toward the end of today's meeting to conduct a very brief poll to get your perspective on how we did and how we're doing. Next page, please. Who are we? MHTC. I'm going to go through this super fast. Ryan is here, and I'm delighted to welcome Ryan. Thank you for joining. We'll be starting, kicking off in just a moment. Who is MHTC? We're a not-for-profit that over the last 43 years has established a brand, for lack of a better word, a presence as an independent and unbiased convener of the health data community, as experts on health data standards and regulations. We have a local focus, but a national influence. Local is how healthcare is done. National is how things happen and get changed at a broader level. And we pride ourselves on bringing to market innovations that allow organizations to reduce the cost and complexity of being prepared for a more interoperable future. Next page, please. This I'll go through super fast. We offer governance services, exchange services, and analytics services. We are launching sponsorship services in 2022. Sponsors are members in our consortium. They're not outsiders, but we want to be able to provide value to organizations that are beyond the payer-provider core of MHDC's membership. We do this with a number of services and activities, including the Vantage Point series of interviews, the Forum for CIOs, CTOs, CMIOs, where we talk about technology at probably the greater depth than we do in other venues, and webinars, just like we're having today. So thank you for your time and attention today. I'm going to introduce Ryan Howells, and then Ryan, I'm going to ask you to take it from there. Ryan Howells is a principal at Levitt Partners based out of the Washington, D.C. office. Ryan has worked with the White House, Congress, HHS, and the VHA on healthcare policy and interoperability issues. He currently helps lead the CARIN Alliance, a multi-sector private-public alliance focused on giving consumers digital access to their health information. Give me just one moment. I am receiving a message from our host that will allow me to make sure that Ryan is connected to us and that we are connected to Ryan. Lynn, I don't know if you were able to see that as well. Let's see, I'm going to promote Ryan too. Co-host. Okay, hey, Ryan, welcome. I'm glad you've made it.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks, Denny.
We are, you know, this is Zoom, but we're doing a Zoom, different type of Zoom. So everything is different, and we're learning all over again about how to do this. I appreciate your patience and forbearance. As I mentioned, Brian is a leader of the CARIN Alliance, which is a multi-sector private-public alliance focused on giving consumers digital access to their information, their health information. Ryan is a member of the CMS Medicaid Information Technology Architecture Governance Board, or the META Board, the Care Quality Steering Committee, ONC's FAST Identity Tiger Team, the Technology Association of Georgia's Digital Health Board, and the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition. He also serves as a board observer for multiple healthcare companies. Before joining Levitt Partners, Ryan was the general manager for the government business unit of a private exchange software vendor, where he oversaw the implementation of software in 3 different state-based marketplaces, managing a multi-million-dollar P&L and being involved in the company's IPO in late 2014. Earlier in his career, Ryan led the government operations division for iHealth Technologies, now Versend Technologies, and served as an account executive for numerous regional and national health plans. Ryan, thank you for joining us. Welcome to our webinar series from MHDC. We're delighted to have you, and we turn it over to you.
Thanks, Denny. This is going to be fun. I'm excited to be here and participate with this group. And I know you can hear me okay, Denny, as well?
We can, and
okay.
I can.
Great. I know this is a very forward-leaning group, and so I'm really excited to chat today. So I have two names on the screen here, myself and a gentleman named Kyle Newman, who some of you may know. Kyle actually operated the Safe trust framework for many years. Safe Identity just got acquired by Direct Trust recently. Usually I co-do this with Kyle, but I put his name up there because any of the detailed discussion around trust frameworks, Kyle's and Scott Stewie, who leads Direct Trust, are two of the best people on the planet to talk about that. So we lean on him heavily, and I want to make sure we called out his incredible contribution and Scott's contribution to this work. So let's dive in. So, you know, as we know, you know, individuals right now, data access primarily is within the HIPAA space. So between covered entities and between business associates. There are lots of lawyers involved in those discussions, and there are lots of data use agreements that are involved in those discussions and other things because of the business models and use cases that are primarily associated with that type of data exchange. As you all know, there is a new kind of data exchange that is just in the process of unfolding, which is what we call consumer-directed data exchange. It's the ability for an individual consumer to aggregate their healthcare information to an application of their choice. Now, what's interesting is the consumer is not inside of HIPAA, meaning they're not a business associate. They don't sign a data use agreement. They don't go through the process of you know, becoming a business associate in any way, shape, or form with a covered entity. They actually sit outside of HIPAA. They sit in the Federal Trade Commission regulatory space. And that's where the consumer sits and has always sat. In fact, the rest of your life, pretty much, in terms of data exchange, happen in the FTC regulated environment under what's called Section 5A, which talks about doing no harm to the consumer. Well, this is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that we have a lot more freedom, meaning we have a lot more ability for us to be able to leverage and utilize new ways to exchange this data using modern internet technologies that we've never had before. That includes, for the techies around the room, OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, and obviously the FHIR APIs and all the other things that we've had. But it's bad in the sense that we have to ensure that the data is protected either at or above what we have come to expect within HIPAA over the last 20 plus years. And so that is our primary challenge within CARIN, is how do we do that? How do we ensure the privacy, the security of the information when it leaves HIPAA at or above what we have come to expect as it stayed inside of HIPAA? We have a misnomer in this country, unfortunately, that says that HIPAA is the absolute highest standard. Not everyone believes this, but is the absolute highest standard of data privacy and security we could possibly have in healthcare. I have come to realize that is not true. HIPAA is a phenomenal starting point. In fact, we view it in CARIN Alliance as the floor, meaning it's the minimum standard we'd like to have in place. We believe we can go much, much farther in terms of securing the information, making it personalized, tying it to the individual user, making sure their consent preferences are honored and respected throughout the ecosystem, all kinds of things, using modern technologies that are much more secure than what we have today in some of the query-based exchange that we have. We think we can actually go further, and that has been the CARIN Alliance's mission from day one. And that is the only way that we change. The other thing I would make mention of this slide is that too often when we lovingly think of this HIPAA box. And by the way, if you have questions at any point during this call, I'm a good multitasker. You can put it in the chat and I will address it as we go through. And we can also save it till the end for a more robust dialogue. But when I think of this, lovingly think of this HIPAA box, we've always thought about problems in data exchange only in the HIPAA box, meaning how do I get more information from my payer so that I can take on more risk? How do I, if I'm a payer, how do I get more information from the provider so I can better understand how to do care coordination? Those are the kinds of questions. And if I'm a business associate, how do I make sure I have the right data for me to do the pieces of functionality that I need? Those are the questions we always typically ask because it's really been the primary and almost only way where data has been exchanged up until now. We have a chance to actually rethink the entire way data is exchanged in this country. Think of an entirely new process. And that's where I want to really try to push us on today, is how do we think about this in an entirely new way, a person-centric way, person-centric level consent, person-centric identity, not organizational identity. How does this start to change things? We don't have to necessarily do patient matching all the time, and that's the only way we do identity. We don't even have to wait for an identifier from the federal government. We can actually do this today, and it's going to be something that we can be able to have in a meaningful way. So again, as Denny mentioned, kind of who we are, and I think some of you probably, hopefully will know this, but we are a group of about 70 multi-sector stakeholders, both public and private sector, who have come together to be able to focus exclusively on this problem of how data moves between regulated environments, between the HIPAA regulated environment and the FTC regulated environment when someone invokes their HIPAA individual right of access. We have all kinds of players in this space. We have some of the big tech companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, and Microsoft that are involved. We have some of the big payers like Humana and the Blues and United and CVS Health and Cigna, Evernorth, those types of folks. We have big healthcare delivery systems like New York Presbyterian and Marshfield and Cedars-Sinai and a whole bunch of others. We've got patient advocacy organizations like the National Partnership for Women and Families, Caregiver Action Network, and individual patient care advocates like Morgan Gleason and others. We have consumer-facing applications too, startups that literally two people in a garage have said, look, I've heard about this FHIR API stuff and it looks really cool and we've got an idea. And it literally starts with that kind of a concept and saying, how do we actually empower the patient or the caregiver with more information and better information than they do today? We make room for all of them, from pre-revenue companies to multi-billion-dollar multinationals, and for individual advocates. Everyone in between, we make room for them, as long as they can add some meaningful value to the conversation. And that's again, our focus is business to consumer. So here's how we break up our business per se, or I'm sorry, break up our work, I should say. One of the things that we do is we find a way where we can be able to break up the work into 4 specific areas. One is what we call identity and access management. And this is digital identity, both for the individual and for the organization. And this is what we're going to spend most of our time on today. The second thing is the API gateways, which, unless you've been living under a rock, and I know this group has not been living under a rock, but FHIR APIs are here to stay. It is the way in which we're going to significantly exchange data, not only in the HIPAA-related environment, but also in the consumer-related environment in the future, and these for many, many different use cases, because it's going to modernize the way for these APIs to be exchanged. We have developed 3 different APIs within the CARIN Alliance. One is related to the CARIN IG for Blue Button. So this is all the explanation of benefits, and hundreds of payers across the country are implementing that API as we speak, including CMS has already implemented it for the Blue Button technology. The second is what we call real-time pharmacy benefit check, which allows for a consumer to gain access to their formulary and benefit information, out-of-pocket costs, therapeutic alternatives, and cash price. And that's an opportunity that we're working with CMS on what they call the beneficiary real-time benefit tool, which as of January 1st, 2023 needs to be implemented by all Part D plans in the US. And so this provides an opportunity for those Part D plans to empower their members with that real-time benefit check information that they need. It's already installed on the provider side as of a year ago. The third area is the application registration process. And people are like, what? That doesn't make any, I've never heard of that before. What does that mean? Well, if you're not already, you or your vendor are going to be involved in application registration. And this is the process by which a third-party app, and by the way, this could be a consumer-facing third-party app or it could be a B2B app, would come to your endpoint and say, I want to register with you. And you need to give them what's called a client OAuth secret in order for them to be able to use the patient's username and password from your portal in the actual app to aggregate or access that information. We have written, just as a side note, it's on our website, a best practices guide. It's actually over 50 pages of how apps can more seamlessly register with endpoints that we're hoping that the industry will adopt. That process is super important because for us to have true interoperability, we need to make sure the apps are involved in that interoperability process, and we've got to nail that registration process. And then the final thing is consent-based data sharing. Consent-based data sharing is really related to how do we ensure that the members or the individual's preferences are honored throughout the process. We don't have a lot of time to get into this today, but it becomes a really interesting problem to solve because we are quickly moving to an area where the data is going to be inside HIPAA, the data is going to be outside of HIPAA, the data is going to start inside HIPAA, the data is going to start in the FTC environment, like social determinants of health data, for example. And we're going to have to find a way where the individual's preferences for where that data gets shared and how it gets shared need to follow them throughout the ecosystem. So if I've got SDOH data that starts in the FTC regulated environment and I'm sharing that with my provider, how does my provider know what my individual preferences are for how that data should be used, accessed, and managed? Just like if it went the opposite way and I was getting my clinical data from my provider and aggregating it to an app of my choice, how do I make sure the app is following a prescribed set of guidelines for how they should honor and respect my data sharing preferences? So this is all things that we're going to have to solve over the next few years in a meaningful way. So let's dive into identity. That's the topic at hand for today. We organized a whole bunch of really smart people in 2019. It's not an exclusive list by any stretch, but it was an exhaustive list in terms of people inside of healthcare, but also people outside of healthcare. You see folks here from Capital One and Visa and others that are out there that back in 2019 for a summit where we said, if we were to rethink about identity in a way that's consistent with best practices, not only inside of healthcare, but more importantly, outside of healthcare, what are the things that we need to think about? And it kind of came up, we came up with 5 primary topics, and I'm going to touch on really 3 of them today. One is, it's the first 3. One is authentication. How does a user securely log into a system? What does that start to look like? Right now, we use usernames and passwords primarily. That is garbage. We need to use better ways to be able to authenticate into a system than a username and password, because most of those, unfortunately, are on the dark web and easily accessible. And that's why we have so many security breaches, not only in healthcare, but outside of healthcare. So we need to find a better way to do that. Number 2 is identity. How do I know for sure? I'm going to call on Denny because he's on the screen with me. How do I know Denny Brennan is Denny Brennan? And that he is the carbon life form that I see in front of me today? How do I know for sure that that's the case? And we'll talk about that here in a second. But I also need to know what organization Denny represents, because as I mentioned before, if the data is shared inside of HIPAA, then the organization we need to know is a business associate or a covered entity. And there are certain rules that govern what data needs to be shared with those types of organizations. Likewise, if Denny represents a consumer-facing application like Apple, there are certain rules that govern that type of data exchange. So we need to know for certain who Denny is and what organization he is representing. That's why it's individual and organizational identity important. Number 3, how do we federate trust across an ecosystem? Now, that's a concept that's brand new to healthcare, federation of trust. It's fairly new. Direct Trust is probably the leading authority on this inside of healthcare, and they've done a yeoman's effort on the provider side to try to do that over the last decade. They've done a great job with that. But when it comes to federating trust, not only among providers, but among payers, third-party app companies, pharmaceutical organizations, consumer, I could go on and on and on when we talk about a truly interoperable ecosystem, social determinant of health organizations, community-based organizations. how do we start to federate trust across entities that also cross regulated bodies? This becomes a really fascinating problem to solve, because then it really expands the nature of trust in terms of what we think about trust. It's not just that we trust the regulation is going to protect us. We have to trust the entities, and also trust that they will protect the data no matter where it sits. Fourth was consent. This is talked about informed proactive user consent. It has to do with our CARIN code of conduct, which we can talk about later, another time, I should say. And then the final thing is matching. And typically in healthcare, that's where we start, is on matching. We say, well, how do we match this data and do all this complicated algorithms and try to figure out, how this works out? Well, that's largely because, I may have Denny's old address in Boston. I don't have his new address. And so, because I haven't seen him in a year and a half, and he's moved in that period of time. So what am I going to trust? The new address, the address I have, the one that he's moved to, or the old address that we have? How do we do this complicated algorithms to try to match this information? But someone once said, and I was trying to figure out beforehand, I ran out of time, who said this, but the only constant in healthcare is the patient. And so because of that, we need to trust that Denny's going to provide the latest, greatest information about himself related to his demographic information, so that he becomes the source of his digital identity, not the organization, but that Denny provides that source. And that's what we're doing. That's why we're turning this on its head. It's not that the health plan has the latest, greatest information, or the provider has the latest, greatest information. It's that Denny has the latest, greatest information. And that's where this becomes really profound. So all of you have seen this kind of CMS patient access rule. So I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I would say that this payer-to-payer data exchange, which if you haven't heard yet, CMS is exercising what's called enforcement discretion. So that's not going to go live on January 1st of 2022. Well, let me rephrase that. Some payers may go live on January 1st, 2022, but CMS is not going to enforce the payer-to-payer data exchange rule on January 1st of 2022 until what they call future rulemaking is established. So that implies that CMS is coming out with future rules around payer-to-payer to make it a little bit easier for payers to understand how that should operate. Anyway, as those future rules come out, and as CMS starts to think about this in a little bit more detail and engage with the industry, certainly one of the questions that's being asked around the industry and a lot of the payers that we have within CARIN is, how are you going to do payer-to-payer data exchange? Many payers have come to us and said, there's kind of two primary ways that folks are doing this. This is maybe information overload, Denny, for folks, but one is they're doing it through what's called the Da Vinci payer data exchange model, which involves more traditional HIPAA-related data exchange payer-to-payer. But that assumes that payer-to-payer is part of treatment, payment, and operations. The other model that exists is the patient access API method, where a payer creates their own app and registers with the payer's endpoint. And that payer says, oh, it's Cigna. It's not Denny or using an Apple health records. It's actually Cigna registering at the Humana endpoint. Therefore, they're a covered entity. They're accessing this information on behalf of Denny, who's their new member. And so I can be able to do payer-to-payer data exchange with Denny because he's acting on behalf, for Cigna because he's acting on behalf of Denny. So patient access API is a way where a lot of payers are thinking about using these concepts of digital identity as we move forward.
Can I interrupt you there for a moment, Ryan?
Yeah, sure.
How, under that model, how do you know that Denny has given approval to Cigna to get the data?
Yes, there's a lot of conversations going in on that, but at the end of the day, what's going to happen is that Denny is going to log into Cigna's portal, just like they do today, and authenticate himself and say, I want access to my health information from Humana, who was my previous payer 5 years ago. And so when he authenticates in, it's just like the patient access API, he has consented to get allowing Cigna to go to Humana to get access to his information. And when he does that, then Cigna can go get that information on behalf of Denny. That's a 30-second answer to probably a 2-hour conversation. Does that help?
Yeah, we can leave it there for now.
Okay. I think ultimately what it comes down to is Denny needs to be identity proofed, and Cigna needs to be organizationally identity proof, so that Humana knows for certain that Denny is who he says he is, and Cigna is who they say they are. And when we know that, we can be able to exchange this data in a more seamless way. But it's a great question. It's something the industry is struggling with pretty significantly right now. All right, so let's talk about authentication. With authentication, we talked about usernames and passwords as the primary way that people authenticate today. That's not going to be the way that folks are going to authenticate in the future. The way that folks are going to authenticate in the future is by doing what's called either two-factor authentication, or also what's called on-device authentication, which is related to biometrics. So I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but if you're super interested in this, you can look up the FIDOalliance.org. All the major platforms, Android, iOS, and Microsoft, and all the major tech companies and the banking industry, and probably about 700 organizations have adopted FIDO as being their new way in which they're authenticated. And you probably have seen this in your consumer life already, but not realized it. It operates very similar to Touch ID on Apple. Touch ID right now unlocks the username and password on your phone, but they have moved with the latest version of iOS, as well as Android 7 or higher, to this FIDO protocol, which basically means that the combination of the biometric in your finger and the cryptographic key that's stored in your phone and not connected to the internet are the two factors that actually authenticate you into the system. That information isn't federated anywhere, doesn't go anywhere, but the combination of those two factors, again, a kind of a public-private key type of an arrangement, allows for you to log into these systems. And it allows for you to have the device, it allows for you to, again, keep the biometrics stored on the phone, and the cryptographic key in your phone. And so that authentication mechanism becomes a really powerful way in which we can unlock these websites, rather than entering in the username and password, which involves notoriously what they call man-in-the-middle attacks that will compromise specific site issues. So from an authentication perspective, we said, great, let's use FIDO. In fact, we've been promoting the use of that for many years now in healthcare, and I know that there are many organizations, health plans, and providers that are thinking about using this more secure way to authenticate that's an open standard going forward. So then we said, let's turn to identity. Let's talk about digital identity. For those of you, again, who are policy nerds, maybe like me, I equate myself in that category, you will see that the Trusted Exchange framework that came out, the Common Agreement was actually what came out most recently, but the Trusted Exchange framework that came out a couple of years ago referenced the fact that they want anyone who's participating in that Trusted Exchange framework, who are consumer-facing applications, to be able to ensure that the individual consumer has been identity-proof to what's called an IL2 level or higher. So this is based on the NIST 863-3 guidelines. It's called Identity Assurance Level 2, and this is the guidelines that is, and also Authenticator Assurance Level 2. FIDO is about an Authenticator Assurance Level 2 or 3, depending on how you use it. But this is the guidance that had come out from TEFCO, something that we actually recommended in CARIN. You can read this on our website back in 2017 when the NIST guidelines actually first came out. The interesting thing about healthcare is most healthcare organizations identity proof an individual somewhere between an IL1 and an IL2 level. Most actually don't go to the higher IL2 level. So what is comfortable now, this goes back to my comment earlier about raising the bar in terms of HIPAA protection. We want to raise the bar to an IL level 2 or higher, but we also wanted to make sure that we raise that bar, ensuring that we have equity across the board. And so that everyone, regardless of whether they have a government issued identity or not, can get identity proof to an IL level 2 or higher. And that's the hard, heavy lifting that we're trying to do now, is how would that actually work in healthcare? And so there's a lot of conversations going along in that, but the goal of this is the same, which is how do we ensure that everyone has this kind of IL2 credential? Let's talk a little bit about organizational identity. We don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but there is a interesting framework called the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, or GLIFE. I think it's glyph.org if you want more information, which is a consortium of financial services industry and also regulators around the world who have created a framework for how to do organizational identity. And it's overseen by 71 regulators. They're not only financial organizations that have a GLIFE identifier, but there are other organizations as well. It's an open standard. It's a not-for-profit Swiss foundation, has independent directors, and it's a framework that we like in healthcare because we do a little bit of this organizational identity proofing today. We just don't have a good structure that everyone is using right now today. There's pockets of things like Direct Trust does some stuff around organizational identity proofing, and others do on a kind of a one-on-one basis, but we don't have a good framework for this. And so what we like about this is existing frameworks can actually be incorporated in the GLIFE framework. And we can have a framework for how to do organizational identity proofing going forward. I won't get into a lot of this detail, but there's it involves, again, all open source ability to make this happen. There's an ISO standard that's behind it. This legal entity identifier identifies all types of things related to the legal identity itself. You can call an API that from one of these, what they call legal operating units, that issue these legal entity identifiers to ensure that the organization is who they say they are. And as I mentioned, there can be multiple legal entity identifier issuers. So for example, you could have the recognizing coordinating entity be an issuer. You could have ONC or CMS be an issuer. You could have Direct Trust be an issuer. That's why we like the flexibility in this, is that provides some of that ability for organizations to identity proof themselves. All right, I'm going super fast here, but any questions? Let me pause there, Denny, if we've got any questions from the group at all from this first half of the presentation.
Well, I certainly have a question, Ryan, and I haven't heard my name mentioned so many times in a presentation. I'm deeply flattered, albeit regardless of the circumstances. So thank you. We talk about and you've talked about the trusted exchange framework, which, when we look at TEFCA from one perspective, we see at one sort of fundamental level, a rationalizing of health information exchanges to a higher standard and to a common standard, a trust framework, which doesn't sound like APIs. It sounds like moving, large amounts of data from one warehouse, for lack of a better word, one entity to another. We don't see patient mediation in there. Not that it should be. We haven't figured that out yet. But my question is, could you talk a little bit more about how something like the trusted exchange framework and the common agreement and this API patient-mediated health data system come together? Because one looks like it's kind of behind the scenes and the other one looks like it's right in my shirt pocket. And it's a difficult sort of reconciliation for many of us to make in our minds.
So consumer-mediated access or consumer-directed exchange is a permitted purpose under the trusted exchange framework. And there's some, high-level thoughts in the first version of the trusted exchange framework that kind of talks about that a little bit. I will say that the first version of the TEF and the first version of the common agreement doesn't include anything related to FHIR. That is largely by design. They are largely looking at ways in which data is exchanged today, largely in the provider world with CCDA and the other ways, IHE type protocols of how that actually happens today. We expect, and what's been said publicly, is that that there will be other versions of the trusted exchange framework and common agreement that are come out related to FHIR. And so that's where we are playing primarily, Denny, is in the FHIR space. And we're not waiting for the ONC although we're grateful for them and Sequoia's work in moving this forward, we're trying to get ahead of that and trying to get industry consensus on how this is going to operate, as well as engaging with our public sector partners, so that when we get to the point where we can include this, hopefully, in a future version of the Trust Exchange Framework or Common Agreement, that will have good widespread consensus. Let me give you one example, Denny, of that, a practical example of how the industry is moving a little faster than the regulators. Commonwealth and Carry Quality have both come out and said for their FHIR-based API data exchange for clinical data, they would expect and would like that individual third-party apps to go through an IL2 digital credentialing process in advance of them actually requesting the information from Commonwealth or Carry Quality in the ways in which they request it today through CCDA. So that's a way in which they've advanced it, even in advance of any type of guidance coming out from ONC. And it's very similar to what we're talking about here, which is how do we instill digital identity proof credentials into the ecosystem, and that hopefully becomes a national standard that's accepted even before the regulators kind of get.
But they can't require that for the patient access APIs, because that's not, they're required to accept anything that, anyway, never mind.
Well, so the Trusted Exchange Framework and the Common Agreement is still optional. I think some people may think I thought it was required, but it is still, it's still optional. But they can, because they're, especially Commonwealth, they're a private sector entity, they can require that from a private sector entity perspective.
Not for third-party APIs that are getting, let's have this conversation offline.
We have questions coming in. We have one question coming in the Q&A. Janice, do you want to provide that?
So are these next generation of identity and trust systems configured as centralized or decentralized repositories? Would a decentralized system be more secure, scalable, and stable than a centralized approach?
That's actually what we're going to talk about next. But the
So let's
the quick answer, the quick answer is it's decentralized. And when I say decentralized, what I mean by that is that the consumer will have options as to where they prove their digital identity. And that's why we need to federate trust. And it also means that the consumer, when you say centralized, the way that I'm interpreting that is the consumer doesn't need to wait for a national patient identifier to say, that's my centralized identity, and I'm going to use that in multiple locations. What we're saying is that we would have multiple decentralized ways, meaning multiple options for the consumer to prove their identity, and they're going to use one of those trusted approaches to do that across systems. Hopefully that answers the question.
And just as an FYI, we have some questions that we got in advance. I'm going to hold them to the end.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thanks, Janice.
So as we think about federation and trust and this person-centric approach to healthcare, we think about the ways in which the information is being shared now with these individual organizations. And so as we look at federation of trust, where have we seen this problem before? And we've seen this problem, in financial services where they've had to federate trust across a whole bunch of different endpoints. We've even seen that in the internet as it relates to browser-based technology behind the scenes, the certificate authorities that are behind the scenes that actually power the internet. So we do have lessons learned for how we can federate trust across an ecosystem that we can be able to leverage and utilize. We have this interesting, I won't go through this in detail because it takes a while to kind of get through this slide, but in a nutshell, what this slide is saying is that today, a member can go to a payer whom they trust and whom they're registered with, or at least I don't know if they trust them, but they register with them. And then that payer can then be able to integrate with one or more than one provider. But every time that they do that, they have to, again, create these new agreements with them, these new data use agreements, these new federation agreements, all the things related to them. So it becomes almost an N of infinity problem. And it's the core of really what becomes difficult within healthcare, because of the many different ways in which data could be exchanged and should be exchanged. But the problem exists is that we have these unmanaged or unknown legal liabilities in these bilateral agreements with each of these identity providers. And so we need really this ability to say, and also the interoperability problem becomes an issue too, because the ways in which they're connecting to each of these endpoints could be very different. In an ideal future state, we have an opportunity as an option. I want to be clear about this. All of this is voluntary and all of this is optional. We're not advocating for the fact that this is the only way in which digital identity could be managed. This is all a voluntary exercise, which is the member could go to the payer, and the payer could potentially be registered with the trust framework organization, who could then be able to federate trust amongst these different relying parties. And the way that they do that is through the ability to not only do conformance testing, they're also what's called a policy management authority, but then they also federate liability too. And that is important for digital identity, because if you have an entity that can federate liability, you also have a way in which that can be decentralized. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but it's the way in which other entities, as we saw previously, have done this and have been extremely successful in how they are federating this across a marketplace. Sorry, I've just, so this kind of gives you a thought of literally what the trust framework is. We're federating trust rather than the identities themselves. We have the ability for these required vendors to procure, issue their own credentials when engaging in business that you can rely on. So the ability here is that you can say, hey, I can go to a digital identity provider, and if that digital identity provider has been certified by one of these trust framework organizations, I know they're following the industry standards. I know that they're following, and they're following ways that they can be interoperable with others. And they're also, because they're registered with one of these trust framework organizations, they can also federate that liability as well. And they can support multiple use cases: authentication, digital signatures, encryption, all types of things related to the liabilities or the warranties across these. So it's one of the reasons we have the trust frameworks. And as I mentioned, direct trust is one example of that and has been around for quite a while on the provider side. So we said, well, how do we kind of bring all these things together? How do we really federate trust using digital identities? And we created a white paper. You can read that on our website on carinalliance.com underneath the digital identity section, where we said, what would federation of trust actually look like? So in the physical world, we prove our identity. One of the ways, I should say, that we prove our identity in the physical world is by going to get a driver's license. You don't just provide one identifier there, like a national patient identifier, to prove your identity. You actually provide multiple trusted identifiers there. You provide your gas bill and your mortgage statement, or your rent, or your passport, or any number of other things that they accept as being proven identifiers in the physical space. And then in exchange, they give you a physical digital identity, which is your driver's license. And then you can use that with multiple, what we call relying parties in the ecosystem. That's the same type of a model that we're trying to form here in healthcare, is that, as an option, individuals can get one digital identity credential that they'd like, and then they can use it across multiple different endpoints. So here's how this would work. This is the big slide, which is you would have, and we do have today in the market, multiple identity providers. We'll start here on the bottom. These are what's called issuers that issue these digital credentials at a NIST IL2 level or higher. ID.me is one of them. Ademia does one for mobile driver's license. I know MasterCard has one. There's also one called login.gov, where you can actually get a login.gov credential that's been identity proof, and you can use it at the IRS or Social Security or any of the other myriad of different government entities that are out there. The VHA has one for all their, for veterans who want to log into their multiple websites within the VHA. They can use ID.me or one of the other federated credentials that they have in place. These are identity providers that have both OpenID Connect as well as PKI-based identities. We have not addressed distributed ledger technologies or DIDs or other aspects of that, and that's been by design, and I'm happy to talk about that if folks are interested. But that's a very different paradigm, and it's also a paradigm, as we've spoken to some of the smartest people on the planet about this, that's likely anywhere between probably 5 to 7 years away at a minimum in almost any industry right now, and having actually a true in production blockchain ability for individuals to actually prove their identity. So we're a little ways away with that. We were trying to find ways where we can actually take the existing technologies that are in production today and being utilized, and those are more API based or PKI based, and how those could actually be installed in this ecosystem. So multiple identity providers, they get certified by multiple trust framework organizations. As I mentioned to you before, a few of those. Direct Trust is a PKI-based trust framework organization. Kintera is an API-based trust framework organization. DIAC is in Canada, very similar to NIST, but they are essentially a trust framework organization as well. But they would get certified by these, they would certify these specific issuers. And then what we're doing in CARIN is we're tying these trust frameworks together. We're kind of the fabric between these trust framework organizations, because when we brought them together over a year ago, we realized that their policies are very, very similar across the board. You know, how long until someone needs to get a new identity credential, for example, or what's the process for how that actually works. And so our role right now, our goal is to create policy equivalency across the trust framework organizations. And if we can do that, then we'll have trust with these relying parties. In other words, a relying party can use any of the identity providers, whether they're PKI-based or API-based, who's certified by their respective trust framework organizations, who are bound together by the fabric associated with this policy equivalency that we're developing around the Digital Federated Trust Agreement. And I know someone asked about the role of the common agreement in this. Well, this is a great role for the common agreement. As Danny mentioned, I sit on the CARI Quality Steering Committee, and this is a conversation I know we've been having for quite some time, which is how do we integrate some of the work that we're doing into the overall common agreement. This is certainly one option for how that could actually happen, because as long as these identity providers are certified by these trust framework organizations and tied together by this Digital Federated Trust Agreement, we can start to have trust across the ecosystem. Let me pause there for a second. Any questions on that before we go any further?
Not at present, Ryan, but
okay,
we're pondering. I can speak for myself. I'm pondering and
all right, great.
Pulling my questions together.
Well, we're in the back half of the presentation now. So this is I think we've got just a few slides left, and then we'll open it up for other questions. Some people have said, well, how are we going to actually operationalize this? So this is the operational discussion that we want to have. Like, what does this actually start to look like? Well, we have come to understand over the last few months that HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, has in production today an identity broker service called XMS. They created it largely for individual contractors who contract with HHS so that they can have an ability to use a credential, digital credential, that they have received from a third party, and that they could use that to log into the HHS systems. So it's, you know, FSMA certified, it's FedRAMP certified, it's, you know, everything for the federal government that's out there, it's certified against. It's in production today, and it's super flexible. So it supports 863-3 and identity proofing. It's actually really pretty super cool. And what it does is it says, if you were to come into this system and you were to log in, you can choose which login method you'd like to choose from. So you can choose your login.gov credential that you've already created with the IRS. If you want to go ahead and log in with that, you can do that. This is PIV or CAC, which for government employees, they'll know what that is, but it's a way in which they authenticate in their system today. You could use ID.me. You could use, and I could go through the list of Idemia, for example, or LexisNexis, or others that actually offer these user-specific logins or authentication mechanisms. You can select that login method, and then it would go through a process for you to actually enter that information in. Because you're an established and approved identity provider, it would authenticate you with that system. We like this for a few reasons. One is, if you think about it, we could have, this potential, sorry, it's going crazy on me now, Denny. There we go. All right. We could have this specific, let's call it a widget, this XMS widget, on as many healthcare organizations' websites as would like to volunteer to be part of this. And then XMS widget could actually have these approved credentialing service providers or identity providers, as I mentioned before, who've been certified by one of these trust framework organizations on the site. And so that's why we said it's a decentralized way, because it's decentralized in the sense that you have a choice. You have the ability of choosing which type of login method you want to use. Now, again, I want to reemphasize this fact. This is in addition of any way that you log in today. So we're not saying that you need to abandon the ways in which you provide portal access today to your users. We're saying that above and beyond that, an additional way that you could provide is to say, hey, log in with these approved credentials that you would like to use. And that's kind of the foundation of the pilot that we'll talk about here momentarily as we go forward. So this is just all a list of the 1.5 years worth of work that we're still working on. The Federated Trust Agreement, there's a draft contract, there's a governance policy and a charter. We have a credentialing policy. We expect, and cross our fingers, that we're going to get through a lot of this work by the end of Q3 of this year. It's a very, very difficult work to do, but we feel confident that this year we'll get that done. But we are actively planning in Q4 to start a pilot on these types of ideas. So this is the last slide that I'll show, and then I'll pause. Second to last slide. This is how they all come together. Patient Access API is obviously going to be member portal based, at least initially. But if you haven't gone live with your Patient Access APIs, we are encouraging you to go get one of these standalone identity providers that are NIST 863 compliant, because if we do, that can be part of this federated network. For payer-to-payer, as we mentioned, we think that's going to be the primary use case post January 1st for how this actually operates. All right, so this is the last slide, Denny, which is this is the pilot that we're hoping to do. And many ask, well, here's who I am, how could I participate? So if you're in that camp and are curious about how this could actually work, because we have to test out all these theories and these open standards that we have created. If you're a third-party application, what we're asking is to go partner with one of these IDPs that issue these IL2 digital credentials. And I've listed a few of them here. If you're a health plan, the big question that you have is whether you're going to be an identity provider, meaning either do it yourself or rely on one of these IDPs that are out there today, or you're going to be a relying party, meaning you aren't necessarily going to be in the business of proving someone's identity, but you're going to accept that identity from another source. We need both around the table for our pilot. And so we need both health plans that will be identity providers and also health plans that are willing to rely on others to prove that identity. On the provider side, most of them rely on their EHRs. As we've spoken to the EHR community, they've mentioned that they're upgrading their identity systems as we speak, and there's a lot of interest in this topic, especially because of TEFCA coming down the pipe. But we're really interested in providers that have separated their IDP service or their customer access management service from their backend EHR. And most of the time that's providers or health systems that have multiple EHRs where they've had to have a single sign-on in place. So if you're one of those, we'd love to talk to you. If you're an IDP, we're asking them to get certified by one of the trust framework organizations that are out there. And if you're a relying party, this is the main question, which is what questions do you need to get answered internally before you can participate in the pilot? What that means is if you're a relying party, what that's implying, and this is the crux of the pilot that we're trying to solve for, is that you're not going to prove someone's identity. You're going to rely on someone else to prove that identity, and you're going to trust that that information has been done correctly and so that they can authenticate into your system. Well, who needs to sign off on that inside your organization? Is that legal? Is that operations? Is that your cybersecurity team? Is it your IT team? It's probably the answer is all of the above. And probably the answer is you may not have ever asked that question before. And so we're hoping that those questions can start getting asked and answered internally so that we can start to be able to answer them as part of the pilot so that we can build up that trust in the ecosystem. And then if you're a trust framework organization, there's a Tiger team that we're part of. So Denny, with that, I have spoken way too much. Here's my contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the group has.
Yeah.
But I appreciate the time.
Before we go
Thank you,
to,
Ray.
there are some questions, but can we ask for clarification on 2 points that you addressed? The first one is that we point out that the end of Q3 of 2021 is actually today for most people. So do you have a time frame? What is the end of Q3 from your perspective?
Well, we stretch it to October. So
Okay.
we're hoping for the end of this month. I would say that it's not, there's not a direct reliance on the completion of our, direct trust framework agreement, or I should say trust framework agreement to start the pilot. We're going to probably start that activity in Q4 and then finish up the trust framework agreement going forward.
Okay, great. And then there was also, can you clarify when you talk about federated liability, what that means or how that might work?
Sort of. This is where Kyle comes in because he actually operates this in production and has operated a trust framework for the last decade. So it's a great question for Kyle. The quick answer is that there are specific rules for when you federate an identity in an ecosystem, and everyone has a role in how that works. And you are only liable for accomplishing your specific role in that federation ecosystem. And if you are negligent in your role, you'll be sued based on that specific role that you have, potentially be sued. But that's the purpose of the trust framework, is that it identifies and enables and labels individuals, companies, and organizations based on the specific role they have in the federated ecosystem. Now, beyond that, more than happy to pull Kyle in for more detailed discussion because he does a much better job explaining that than I do. But it's a fairly new concept, but it's something that's been actually implemented in healthcare, mainly in the pharmaceutical industry, for the last decade. So it does work.
Great. We do have, Denny, I don't know if you had wanted to say something. I might have cut
No,
you
go
off,
ahead.
but we have
Let's
some
get
other
the questions from the folks in the audience.
Okay. So we have the next questions from the folks in the audience, and then I'll follow on with the ones we had in advance. Is, can you discuss issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? For example, acceptable evidence of identity under NIST standards can be problematic for certain populations. There may be patients from outside of the US. You mentioned driver's licenses. Not everyone has one. Not everyone has the ability to use biometrics for those components. Can you just talk to that generally?
Yeah, so it's something that continues to be at the forefront of our minds with all of this. The quick answer is that there are these individual identity providers have ways to ensure equity across the board, regardless of whether or not someone has a government issued identity or not. Obviously, the most simplified use case is that you do have a government issued identity. But there are other use cases where if you don't have one, they have a way to prove your identity. For example, ID.me is an IL2 certified identity provider, and they have a way you just call a phone number and they will walk you through the ability for you to show your identity proofing. And they have ways in which to do that. They have a whole call center staff that actually provides that ability. That just gives you one example. You just need to have a phone to actually prove that identity. There are other ways as well to make that happen. You mentioned about biometrics. If they don't have fingers, for example, they could use face, they could use iris, they could use other biometrics that's in there, that's available there. But there are ways that we're looking at doing this. And it's definitely at the forefront of our mind. But I also want to stress the fact that we want to ensure that we have an equitable solution to this long term. We also want to see if it actually works at all. I mean, this is really the question is, could we actually federate identity overall and ensure that we have an equitable way of doing that across the board?
Great. So the next question that we got is, what is the biggest obstacle for providers wanting to engage in the pilot as an IDP?
I say this with the utmost of respect, I really do. It's their EHR vendor. Now, let me explain myself. The EHR vendors, I just talked to them yesterday, are completely overwhelmed with what they have to do by the end of next year, okay? And you probably felt that. You may have had an idea for a functionality improvement and they said, don't talk to us till the end of next year. I don't know if they're saying that or not, but it's really, really hard. So anything that's not regulated is something that's getting put on the back burner because of all the things that they have to do. Bulk fire, they've got to do EHI, they've got to do, US CDI, all the things they've got to do for the end of next year. Their plate's overflowing. So it goes back to the point I made earlier, the opportunities for providers to participate are the ones that have already separated or are thinking about separating their identity and access management service from their backend system. If that's something you've wanted to do, or is that something you already have done, that is a great, that would be a great provider for us to work with in terms of this pilot, because we wouldn't have to wait for the EHR vendors. The other thing I'd say about the EHR vendors is, we have this misnomer in healthcare that one sector of the economy is going to solve all of our data problems, and the EHR vendors specifically. And I don't think if you talk to any of them, I don't think that they would say that we're the only option for us to solve all the problems that related to data in healthcare. It's absurd to think that we would put all that on one sector. And so part of this exercise is for us to engage the innovators, the app community itself, both on B2B side and B2C side, to help with the myriad, the thousands of use cases that we've got to solve for, to really move to more of a value-based care and more equitable environment for ourselves and our posterity. And that's what we're really trying to do, is what does that ecosystem start to look like? So hopefully that answers your question, Bo.
Okay, great. And then I don't see anything from the folks who are here, so I'm going to move on to the questions that we got in advance. Excuse me. So someone wanted to know, how is this approach different from the fast identity work that's been ramping up lately? Do we have room for more than one group to be doing major identity work that's supposed to be trying to standardize the industry?
I missed the first part of that. You cut off a little bit. What was the group that they mentioned?
The fast identity, the group under ONC that just got moved into HL7 as an accelerator.
Well, that's news to me, unless it happened the last couple of days, because I'm on that group. It
got announced at the Da Vinci community meeting last week.
Okay. The answer is, yeah, I've been involved in that group for the last couple of years, and the primary thing that they are working on is coming to an agreement from the industry on how to do patient matching. They are not solving the problem of federated digital identity. Again, I've been involved in all those calls, but they are very open to it, and they are very looking forward to adopting some of the things that we have put together. So we're really solving a different problem than they are. And it's this person-centric digital identity and federated identity is something that is really something that we're doing. And like I said, that we're very much open to having others participate in.
Great. That actually leads directly into the next question, which we had someone who was very eager to understand how or if this assists with patient, what you're doing under CARIN, how this helps with patient issues.
With patient what issues?
With patient matching.
Well, that's what we're going to test in the pilot. So here, I'll tell you what our hypothesis is. Our hypothesis is if the patient becomes the source of truth for their demographic information, and the individual relying parties, providers and payers, use the patient as their source of truth, we don't have a patient matching issue anymore. Now, we eventually have to match the patient's identity with their individual records in the system. I get that. That's going to be a process, and we're going to have to agree to what that criteria is, and that's what the Fast Identity Tiger team is doing right now. But once we've actually established someone's individual identity, and it is person-centric and it is person-controlled, then the individual businesses who may not have seen you in 2 years can now have the most updated information that's coming from the individual patient. And when that happens, after they've gone through the initial matching exercises, we think actually patient matching starts to disseminate and maybe even go away long-term. I know that seems like a fairly bold statement, given how many issues we've had in healthcare to date, but we've actually, I'm actually just retorting some of the things that I have heard in other industries as they've adopted these technologies. They've seen amazing progress on this and have kind of confirmed some of the hypotheses that we've had, but we've got to test it. We've got to see if it's going to work.
It sounds like you're relying on just demographic data though, whereas I know that a lot of the studies that we've seen, for instance, there was a big provider system in Colorado that did a study, and they had some large number, I'm talking hundreds or thousands of patients with the same name, the same date of birth, the same, some of them even had like first, middle, and last name, and several other components that were the same. So I don't know that relying just on demographic data will fully do the trick, although certainly it should help.
Yeah, so I just used demographic data as an example, but if you recall earlier, I had mentioned trusted digital identifiers. So that could be demographic data, that could be biometric information that's stored on the device, that could be some of these identity providers are really creative in the sense it could be behavioral analytics, which is the how you use your phone. I know this sounds a little spooky to some degree, but there are things that you do every day. Maybe you get up every morning and check the weather and click on the weather.com app, or you hold the phone a certain way, or you do certain things at certain periods of time. Those behavioral analytics can actually also make up your identity. And it's in a very privacy preserving way. I don't want to scare anybody too much. And we
Too
can,
late.
but it's an opportunity where you can use other digital identifiers to make that happen.
All right. We got a follow-up question in the Q&A, which is, with the move towards person-centric source of truth for demographic data, are controls being considered for at-risk populations? And I don't know if you want, I can unmute this person and have them clarify a little bit.
Sure.
Deb, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and just ask you to clarify slightly, or maybe. Oh, interesting. Apparently I can't do that in this new interface.
Well, can you repeat the question and let's see?
Yeah,
where
let
we
me
can go with
let
this.
me repeat the question. With the move towards person-centric source of truth for demographic data, are controls being considered for at-risk populations?
Yes, as I mentioned, I think, again, first and foremost, this will never be the only way. This is always going to be an option. So I just want to make sure that, and it's also always going to be voluntary. So I just want to make sure we double underline that. It's always a volunteer option. The second point I would make mention is, yes, as I mentioned, there are multiple different credentialing service providers that do accommodate for those who are unbanked or unidentified or don't have government issued identities today. there are ways that our credentialing service providers that do accommodate for that. That won't be specific to what CARIN does or does not do, but we're pushing really hard, and I know the credentialing service providers are pushing really hard
Yep.
to make sure that they have a very equitable ecosystem for anyone who actually comes in.
Yeah, and Deb clarified in that she was specifically wondering about people who don't have a phone.
Right.
Well,
Or access to technology.
right. So there, for those who don't, well, I would, there are situations where that may exist or access to the technology themselves, but if that's the case, they probably wouldn't be logging into an app of their choice. So this is, if someone is just coming into the emergency room to get access to care and are not engaged in their healthcare in any digital way, they wouldn't necessarily need to actually have a digital identity. They could just have an identity that's actually established at the ER, right?
Well, they could have digital identities that aren't tied to a phone. I mean, I know plenty of people who would be happy to do, there are, for instance, third-party apps that are not intended to be on mobile devices, but on computers. Or people who might use something in a web browser on a computer who wouldn't do it on a phone, to give a couple of examples.
Yeah, so I was interpreting this as someone who just wasn't engaged digitally at all in their healthcare.
Gotcha.
Maybe that's not the way that this should have been interpreted on that front. But I guess my point in all of this is that in no way would this ever impact someone's ability to access care. They are one. This is only for situations where someone is engaged in their care or wants to be engaged in their care digitally. How do we make that accessible to everyone who wants that access? And typically, if they want that access, they'll need to have some way to access the internet through a public library or other means, or they need to have some type of a phone where they could actually engage in this process.
Gotcha.
That's kind of the clarification there.
Yeah, I apologize for being so specific there. There have been a lot of things that are very specific phones. That distinction does matter for a lot of these conversations. So I know I've started being very careful about making when I'm talking, at least. So those were all the questions that we had. If there's
Well,
nothing,
I have
Jenny, I'll
a
hand over to you.
question. Thank you, Janice. Ryan, thank you so much for this. This is complicated stuff. We deal with it every day, though. Those of us who are online and who are engaged with trying to establish our identity with a third party often work through Apple or Facebook or Google as an intermediary to spare us the problems of having to remember usernames and passwords, providing us security and cloaking of our real email addresses, as an example. I think we see this a lot, but we're not used to. We don't understand exactly what it is, but the convenience that comes with that, and the level of sort of authentication that goes into that, that's all been done before when you signed up for these services in the first place. So that, combined with the fact that you are on your phone or you're on your device, which has an authentication capacity in and of itself, we see that in action all the time. We're not used to seeing it in healthcare. We have these balkanized entities with isolated pools of data. Sometimes they're HIEs, sometimes they're providers, sometimes they're payers. But I would like to ask you a question related to the interoperability mandates put into law by CMS last year. And one of them is that in those rules, the health plan becomes the access point by which members, patients, connect to the patient-facing API and get all of their clinical data. We see in a number of circles where people are saying they are concerned about this kind of access. They don't know how to do it. What about TEFCA? AHIP has been, pretty outspoken about this. It seems to me that, the ability to implement this kind of technology would be a great boon to organizations, health plans who have been looking for these data for so long, but are struggling with the legal implications of how those data are managed. Could you just talk a little bit about how these might come together, how they might diverge. The idea that that I, as a patient and a member, would log in to my health plan, authenticate myself, and my information, whether it's clinical information from my providers or administrative information from my health plan, would come to me via my having established, my credentials, that I am who I am, and I'm asking for what I'm entitled to ask for. What are your thoughts about that patient-facing API and its use versus these trusted exchange frameworks and I should say these QHINs that are going to emerge from the first round of TEFCA? How do those work together when it comes to this kind of authentication and identity?
Well, so I think there's three aspects to what you're asking about that, Denny. One is, I think more specifically what you're talking about is payer-to-payer data exchange, where I can log into my current payer and have my previous payers that I've had go out and get all my clinical data over the last 5 years and pull that back and then give it to me, right? So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is Patient Access API, which went live July 1st of this year for most payers, which is I can get my explanation of benefit information, which is my financial and administrative data, from my current payer. And then the third piece of this, which is I think is most important, is I don't have to wait for either of those. And I also don't have to go to my payer to get my clinical data. That's been in place for most payers since 2018 with MIPS and MACRA, where I can now actually log into my provider site and I can download this information. In fact, for example, use Apple Health Records as the example, right? They've got hundreds, if not thousands, of health systems now on Apple Health Records, so that I can go to Apple Health Records, I can add my specific health system to it, I can authenticate myself using the username and password from my provider systems portal, and I can access all my clinical data today. Now, I don't have USCDI, which is another 2 or 3 data elements, including the notes, the physician notes that are on there as well. I'll have that post 2023, but that ecosystem already is in place. So I don't have to go to my payer, and I don't have to have my payer be the only way that I get that data. I can actually go directly to my provider or multiple providers to authenticate myself and then to be able to access that data. So I think at the end of the day, I think the goal was to find multiple ways, at least from what we've heard publicly from CMS and others, is to find multiple ways by which an individual can aggregate their own data, whether it's from their provider, whether it's from their payer, whether it's from a combination of both. I think the goal really was to figure out ways to do that. And the other thing is the price transparency rule too, right? So that's another important concept, which is how does that price transparency start to come into play? And now with the current administration, those will continue to move forward. But there's this now real important discussion we need to have about equity and access. And how does that start to play into this role of transparency and data exchange, so that we can have not only a transparent ecosystem to move towards value-based care, but also one that is equitable and accessible by all and doesn't discriminate. So we need to figure out a way to merge those two worlds together. And I think there's good questions that were asked today and other things that are being thought about related to what does that start to look like over time. But I do know, last thing I'll say on this, Denny, is individual access to one's own health information is very much a nonpartisan issue, right? It was started it was started with the ONC and some of the things that actually went forward in the Bush administration. It was continued in the Obama administration. It went to the Trump administration. Now Biden is continuing. It is not something that is any way partisan in nature. It's something that is everyone has been wanting it forever. I use the simple example of getting all my immunization records for my kids going to school. We've moved counties, and I still have to go to my provider to get access to some of that stuff. Why can't I get access to it on my own? I can do that for the rest of my life. I should be able to provide that access. In fact, it is a fundamental right, and it's that right that's been granted under HIPAA 20 plus years ago, called individual right of access, but we just have never had the seamless ability to do that in a secure way, and now we do.
Excellent. Before we finish up, folks, we're going to put a poll up on the screen. We'd like you to provide your commentary very briefly to the presentation today. And while you're doing that, Ryan, I just want to thank you. This is a fascinating discussion, and I'd love to have you back. We want to keep talking with you and with CARIN about how these technologies can be operationalized. You know, in Massachusetts, we have we're not alone in this, but we pride ourselves on having a fairly tight-knit community that wants to do things, you know, the best way, rather than do them incrementally. And we look forward to being able to do more with you and to learn more as this advances. The poll is still running. If we have a few more moments to let the poll finish up.
Denny, there's a question that came in. I think it's a really important one.
Oh, good. Oh, go ahead and answer it, Ryan, by all means.
So Chris asks about how we can move this technology forward with the payers and providers that are very much set in their own methods when we have seen 0 third-party apps register in our dev portals and no patient data being shared. So Chris, number one, please email me and I will give you a list of a bunch of third-party apps that would love to connect with you. That's number one. Number two is we are really early. You know, when they built the railroad tracks and they came together actually at Promontory Point in Utah, they had no idea all of the use cases that would actually occur after building those tracks. We are building railroad tracks for the next generation. And we are in the very, very early stages of what this starts to look like. But if you think about this as a person-centric model, and this could be also obviously provider-centric, that allows for us to start to realize the promise of personalized medicine that we've been talking about for so many years, we can now have, well, I'll end with this story. We surveyed 50 of the best performing ACOs in the country a couple of years ago. And we asked them one primary question. If you could do anything different to be able to maximize value in the ecosystem and to figure out ways to lower costs and increase quality, what would it be? And the overwhelming answer kind of rolled up into one answer, which is we need to get better information to the provider and to the member so they make different decisions than they do today. If we can do that, we can advance value-based care, we can advance access, we can advance equity, we can do all the things that we need to do in order to get people the help they need. And as we know, most of that help isn't specifically with the medical organizations that are available. Most of the help that they need is food insecurity and housing instability and all the things, domestic violence type situations. We can get them that help if they want it. And that's what we're trying to solve for at the end of the day. But we're still in the early stages. So don't give up on this. This is super important. And like I said, Chris, we've got apps that would love to connect with you. Keep in mind, there are 900 health systems out there, and there's only about 30 or so apps that are in the environment. So we're still super early, and they're just prioritizing folks as they come in. But anyway, would love to be able to get you set up there. So anyway, thank you, Denny. Sorry for the long-windedness, but I hope that was helpful.
It's not at all long-winded. It's a complicated question that demands a good answer. We appreciate it. I want to thank our audience. I want to thank Ryan, you especially. This is a fascinating topic. We want to keep having this conversation with you and watch and participate as these initiatives advance. This is definitely something, it's essential to a patient-managed, a patient-mediated health data system, is the authentication and identification of the individual. And, you know, we have hybrids. All solutions will ultimately be hybrid solutions. We know that from years and years of experience, but we also know that what comes out of this kind of technology is a way of identifying and authenticating an individual that is virtually impossible otherwise in a digital world. So with that, I want to thank Ryan, you, and the CARIN Alliance and Levitt Partners for coming to speak with us today. I want to thank our audience. Please use the emails and please reach out to connect to folks who express interest in what we're talking about. And we wish you all a good day and thank you again for your participation. Thank you, Ryan. Take
Thank
care,
you all.
everybody.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.